Bim, I'm sure some of you know, is one of the brightest new stars in Parliament, who interestingly comes from three backgrounds or groups which attract some controversy. He went to a school called Eton, he was a banker, and he's also from a really interesting background with his parents coming here from Nigeria. So tell us a little bit about your background, because it is unusual, and how it informs your politics before we go on to more current things.
Yeah, so yeah, three endangered species, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I went to Eton College, not too far from here. Enjoyed it very much. My parents are, my dad's a doctor in St Albans, an anaesthetist. My mum's a pharmacist. I'm eldest of three. I do look at how much money they somehow managed to find from somewhere. I mean, my parents never inherited anything, and so I marvel at how they managed to do that for me and my brother. And then I studied history at Oxford University College, and then after a bit of time working for George Osborne in opposition, which was particularly amusing, I then went to the city where I became a corporate lawyer doing M&A deals that Ian Martin earlier on was talking about in his in the tent over there, doing M&A deals. And then I, after standing in 2015 for the very strong Conservative seat of Lewisham Deptford, where and I can see some of the Lewisham alumni here. After doing that, I worked in HSBC in strategy, doing restructuring and all sorts of fascinating things. And then I was selected very late, so I was selected for Hitchin and Harpenden 5 days, I think, before nominations, or 6 days before nominations, in May. And it was definitely a baptism of fire in many different ways. But now I've got through the election and found myself here. So there we are.
What's it like finally getting into Parliament? And it's obviously an unusual time in British politics. It was an election which didn't go quite to plan. What's it been like for you, and what's your sort of impressions, your lessons? What have you learned from that?
So beyond all the obvious stuff around getting around and it being, you know, unusual but exciting, I think there are two things which strike me. This I don't think most people fully appreciate when you're an MP. The first is that there's a huge amount of camaraderie on Tory benches. You know, people are kind, they are friendly, they are really happy to see you there, and that is really welcoming. There's also a huge amount of loneliness, because you spend a lot of time, especially in your constituency, but also in Westminster, making sort of decisions on various things that you've never had to do before, and you're just hoping that most of them turn out okay, and nobody really, you know, it's the first time in life where you're making these things and nobody actually tells you what to do. I mean, you really are just doing it and hoping for the best, and so that is quite challenging, but like many things, you hope to get better with it with time.
And obviously you're quite young for an MP. What is your thoughts on how the Conservative Party and politics wider can re-engage? Because obviously the fourth group which you belong to, which isn't necessarily the most popular in the country, and I speak as a journalist who's down there as well, are politicians.
Yeah, so I think that it's important that people I think it's important that people look at this seriously, but at the same time, people shouldn't go into complete panic mode. I think somebody famous and clever said that the Conservative Party only knows two modes, you know, complacency or panic. And we're definitely in panic. So I just think it's important that we take a step back and recognise that just because somebody is young does not mean they have a different brain or a different set of aspirations or they are from a different planet. And so some of these things that are generational differences are not quite as stark as we might see from the start. Now I'll just give a couple of examples. One of the things I've noticed is an increase in values voting amongst my friends. And look, I have friends who, you know, often went to, you know, private schools or went to top universities and work in the city or entrepreneurs. You know, they're not what you might call classic Labour voters, right? But actually, on a values basis, they somehow feel that, you know, the Labour Party speaks to them or is more appropriate for them than the Conservative Party. And I think that we should never discount the impact of values and culture, political and otherwise, social sort of culture on how people vote. So things like being on the right side of things like gay marriage and being on the right side of newer ways of people living their lives, whether it be new modes of self-employment or various other things. Making sure you're on the right side of those trends is quite important culturally for people to feel that they can vote Conservative. But more politically, there is no doubt that the last election was a bit of a wake-up call. I like to think of elections less as, who wins or loses, even though I accept it's easier to do that when you win. But it's as much a feedback loop. So it's what are people telling you with how they voted. And that the last election, what I saw in my seat, I saw it in other places, I've read about it, I've looked at the data, is that Jeremy Corbyn was as much the repository of all the protest votes in the country. And that was one of the reasons why the polls shifted so fast in the election campaign. It was because people worked out, with our lackluster campaign, I think it's fair to say, people worked out that, hold on, to really punish the Tory party, we're going to vote for them. And in the past, the protest vote had been spread amongst more the Lib Dems, UKIP, various other parties. This time, it was all Labour. And we shouldn't deny the fact that just because if somebody's protesting now, if you address their concerns, you can win them back. It doesn't mean you will, but you can, and you have a chance of doing so. So I think that we should be optimistic and positive about that if we make the right decisions.
And what are those concerns, the core ones? I mean, obviously, I suspect we talk about housing and things like that, and inequality. What are the issues you think that can be solved by a prime minister, basically with barely a working majority?
So I think that a thing that I think we should remember, which I think was forgotten in the way we ran the campaign, is that we have a parliamentary, not a presidential system. So the Prime Minister is in a very important position because she can really allow her cabinet ministers to put forward policies and be in front of lots of things. So I think it's important we sort of separate out from the Prime Minister's person. But look, the core of your question around what are these things, we can talk about housing, and I don't think we should necessarily go on about all areas of housing policy, but I think it's important. I think everybody recognizes that as people are older and older before they can afford to buy a home, especially in the southeastern London, what that does is they're almost the sort of Tory way of how Conservatives often think that, once someone settles down and gets married, they're sort of more likely to be Conservative. That's true, but if people aren't settling down and getting married till their 40s, then of course that impacts on the politics. So housing's obviously part of it. But also, I think we should look at two things which I haven't heard so much in the commentary. One is there is actually a real willingness for stability. And what I mean by stability is not status quo, but a sense that the people in government know what they're doing and they've got the interests of the country at heart. And I do think that the Prime Minister's core political value, ever since she became Prime Minister, of stability in that sense, actually is right. And I think that people are craving that and do want that. And that's one of the Prime Minister's strongest suits. Now, having said that, at the same time, there is a sense, especially amongst people of my generation, and look, I only know this from people I speak to and other people may have different experiences, there is a sense that something quite different needs to happen with our economy, with our society, to make people feel that stability and strength that everything's going to be all right. And I appreciate the juxtaposition of those two things is tricky, but I think you can do it, and I think politicians have done it in the past. And if we can give people a sense that we know how the change needs to be done, and then give them the sense of competence that you know how the change needs to be managed, then I think you can win their support.
And last question for hand it on to the floor. If you were suddenly to become Prime Minister, and let's assume you got a 649 seat majority, because we'll presume Caroline Lucas still wins in Brighton. Give us two or three things that you'd like to see done. Wow. And also to shore up the values issue as well, of course.
So I think that the big, and Juliet, and I'm borrowing from Juliet Samuel from the Telegraph, who I heard say this earlier, but in my defence, I did also think this, is that there is definitely a huge change going on with technology that even some of the smartest people involved in that industry don't fully understand. And retraining and adapting to that and helping people do that is really, really important. Now, why do I say that now as opposed to 5 years ago or even 2-3 years ago? To be blunt, I think a lot of the technological changes up until now have affected blue-collar jobs. They've been in factories. If anybody's been near a factory anytime recently, you'll realize how few people actually work in these buildings. They're the most extraordinary places where you just don't see many people, and they make so much stuff. That was all happening. That's been happening for years. Didn't affect what you might call potentially swing voters, because it was blue-collar votes. Now it has hit white-collar voters. It's hitting Tory voters and their kids, and this is frankly very politically that's a big danger. So I think that advancing a set of policies to make people feel comfortable with that change without stepping in the way of that change, which of course I think is overall going to be benefits to the economy, is really important. I think education and skills is always important. If it were up to me, I think that the debate around apprenticeships and skills is slightly skewed, because we still haven't quite worked out whether we're going to do away with what used to be called polytechnics, who are now universities. Are we sure that we want them to be universities, or actually are we really trying to get to a point where they become polytechnics or the equivalent, doing vocational skills, but actually making sure those vocational skills are not scrap heap jobs? Those are some of the jobs in the future. Encouraging companies to take on more people out of school or college rather than university, I think again is an important thing. But then going further up the chain, we need something that somebody above the age of say 25, 26 can go and retrain without being called an apprentice. And again, I think that that's the sort of thing, these are all within government's ability now. It doesn't require any new legislation. I think those are the sort of things we should look at. Promoting share ownership, again, everybody says that, it's always a good thing. The reason why it's harder now is because there are fewer public companies. Companies don't float as much as they used to, because we screwed up the regulations on IPOs. And I mean, I know, because I used to get paid an incredible amount of money for reading these things. And it's incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to float. So guess what? Fewer and fewer companies float, which means more and more companies are bought by private equity houses, and actually ordinary people who work within businesses just have less chance to own part of what they work in. I think they're really interesting things as well. But I'm sure I've forgotten lots of other stuff.
All right, thank you very much. Who'd like to ask a question? Okay, take you, sir.
I want to ask a question about leadership. It's my perception, and I know I'm not alone, that the present leaders of whichever political persuasion are nothing like the caliber of some of the ones that you read about in your biographies. And I wonder what it is we need to do to attract the best people in this country to lead the political parties.
So
that does, of course, imply some disloyalty towards your current leader.
So let me try and answer this. Philip Cowley wrote a letter, I think it was to the Times or the Telegraph the other day, where he said, and someone's nodding, I can't remember if anybody else has read this, but he basically was responding to somebody saying, the quality of politicians is terrible, and he wrote a series of quotes. And then you found out these quotes were from the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, the early 20th century. So I think on some level, these things are cyclical, and there's just a natural cycle to most things, like a business cycle, and sometimes you have a bunch of people who are leading parties who seem like giants, and sometimes you have a bunch of people who are leading parties who don't seem like giants. I think where we are now, and to get to the nub of what you're saying, where we are now is a time where I think both parties are in a state of flux ideologically. That means that it's quite hard as any leader of that party to lead them in a decisive direction if people within the party are not actually sure about which direction that should be. Now, of course, the answer to that could be, well, you need to lead them. But if you're in a place where we're adapting to, whether it be Brexit, the rise of nationalism across Europe, questions about immigration, technological change, economic difficulty, stagnation, inflation coming up, all of these things, if you're having to adapt to all of that, I think it's harder. So I think at the moment, what you're finding, not just in Britain, but in the US, you're finding in Western Europe, is a bunch of leaders who appear to find it harder to lead. But actually, I do think the circumstances they're under are harder than, say, if you look at, say, when Blair became Prime Minister in 1997.
I wonder slightly if Churchill would agree with that. I mean, leaders in the past have had hideous circumstances to deal with. But also, why did you give up what you described as a very well remunerated career in the city to go into Westminster? What was it for you, really, that you wanted to do, beyond the usual cliches that politicians say when asked that question?
I was going to say, which cliche can I come out with? No. So, as I say, look, yes, I left the city, but I always wanted to do politics. So it's wrong for me to say, which I think a lot of politicians say, so, well, you know, I was working in the city, I just thought I'd give it a try. And no. I'd always really wanted to do it. I think for me, it's because I always strongly believed in allowing people and helping people, going to activist point, to fulfill much more of themselves than they can, often on their own. I grew up in a family, as I say, I described at the beginning, but there are bits of my family that are what you might call very sort of wealthy, and there are bits of my family that actually lived in council flats for most of their lives. And I think what that showed me is that when you don't have a big sort of umbrella or cushion, you don't often have confidence, either from your family or your friends, to really go out there and make the most of yourself. School sometimes provides that for some people, you know, a mentor provides that for other people, but I think the core of politics should be, how do you allow people to make the most of their potential? I'm really passionate about it. It's why I came into politics and why I came to the Conservative Party. And
do you want to make the most of your potential by becoming Prime Minister?
Well, look, I don't, and this is trying to make this a cliche-free answer, is you need to, whenever you come into politics, be happy with the job that you're doing. Because, and in the past, in my life, I remember, and this is a slightly odd thing to describe, but I think it illustrates the point. You know, I did Oxford Union politics when I was at Oxford, and you know, I went through all the elections, and it was all going wonderfully, and I thought I was going to be president, and I never really enjoyed any job I was doing, because all I was doing was thinking about my next election and the next job I was doing. And then, of course, I was vice president. I thought I was going to be president, and I lost. And I realised when I lost, I hadn't actually done what I thought I wanted to do any of the period of time, because all I was doing was thinking about the next thing. I'm thinking about being as good an MP for Hitchin and Harpenden as possible. Of course, I'd like it someday to get a ministerial job of some sort. But, you know, at the moment, that is all I'm focused on. And frankly, unless we sort this out, there'll be no ministers, Conservatives, you know, after the next election anyway. So
I think that's the best answer that I've heard to the I'm happy in my job as I am. So. Okay, one more question. Are there any organisers? Are we meant to still be carrying on, or have I overshot the mark? Yeah. Okay, George, do you want to?
Hi. About 20 years, I'm sitting next to my friend James Bethel here. About 20 years ago, we were in the same sort of situation, and it feels like we're in a similar situation. You get these generational shifts in politics, 1945, 1979, 1997. There's a change in culture, that the party becomes a victim of the forces that actually created it in the first place, blindsided by Corbyn, who's addressing genuine issues. And you look at the cabinet, and I'm afraid you think that they don't quite get it. It's a generational thing, and they don't seem to like each other that much. I wish they did. I hope they do, but it doesn't seem to be going that well up there. So it feels to me it's down to your generation, actually, Bim. You're the next one. So what I want to know is, really, what are you guys doing to organise yourselves? You need to organise yourselves. Who are your peer group that you like? What are you doing to get together? You can't just sit there actually doing the job that you like doing. And I'm not talking about going to be leader. I'm talking about ideas, energy, togetherness, community, money, lawyers. You need to get organised. So it's a bit like when von Stauffenberg said, the generals have failed, it's time for the colonels to act. So I just want to know, are you getting organised? Are you talking to your peer group? Because you've got to make the next move.
So there is you are potentially right that we are at a time of sort of cultural change, generational change, that you're sort of swept along a sort of wind of history or tide of history, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And I think that even if I don't accept that we're fully there, we might be going halfway through that. There is definitely a recognition, and I can only speak to people on the 2017 intake and 2015 intake, a few of which are here, that this is happening. And that's one of the reasons why I was talking about the values. That's one of the reasons why I was talking about different ways of using government. That's one of the reasons why I was talking about other things that effectively are getting beyond Brexit. Brexit appears to be the previous generation's fight. And I think voters, younger voters, feel that as well, regardless of which way they voted. And I think that, look, there is a real recognition amongst the 2015 and 2017 and members of the 2010 intake who didn't sort of necessarily become ministers or cabinet ministers, that, you know, things need to move. All I can say is, from what I've heard from people who have much more interaction with, you know, the centre and cabinet ministers than I do, I think there is actually a recognition amongst the leadership that we need new ideas, we need new thinking, we need new ways of doing things. Obviously, Brexit is difficult because it occupies so much government time and energy. But I don't think what you're saying is unheard, and I think it's a point well made.
And hurry up and do it, I think a lot of people would say, because a lot of people are looking to the next generation. But thank you very much, a really interesting discussion.